Late October 1945. The war had been over for 5 months. Sophie Wenzel knew this the way you know something that has not yet finished arriving. Intellectually, completely, and without the feeling of it. The war was over. Germany had surrendered. The man whose photograph had hung in every classroom where she had ever taught was dead in a bunker in Berlin. These were facts she carried the way she carried Werner's letter, close and unexamined, present without being opened. The letter was in her left coat pocket. It had been there since the winter of 1943, folded into quarters, the paper soft at the creases from 2 years of handling it without reading it. She did not need to read it. She had read it so many times in the first months after the news came that the words had arranged themselves permanently somewhere behind her eyes. She kept it because Werner had touched it, because his handwriting was on it, because throwing it away would have been a different kind of losing him, smaller and more deliberate than the first. She was 27 years old. She had taught history and civics at a secondary school in Dresden for 3 years before the final collapse of everything. She had not chosen the curriculum. She had delivered it. For a long time she had told herself this distinction meant something. She was no longer entirely certain it did. Camp Forest sat in a valley in southern Tennessee surrounded by hills that had turned orange and gold in the October cold. The transport truck carrying Sophie and 33 other German women auxiliaries came through the main gate at 4 in the afternoon, and the first thing Sophie noticed was the trees. She had not thought about trees in a long time. The hills around the camp were thick with them, oak and maple and something she did not have a name for, all of them burning with autumn color against a sky, so blue it seemed painted rather than real. She pressed her face briefly to the truck window, and then caught herself, and sat back. Brunhild Scholl, sitting beside her with her bag on her knees and her back precisely straight, said without looking up that the scenery was arranged to create a favorable initial impression. That prisoners were always brought in through the most aesthetically pleasing approach. She said it the way she said most things, pleasantly, informatively, as if she were sharing useful knowledge rather than instruction. Sophie said nothing. She had been in Brunhild's company for 11 days, since the processing facility on the coast, and she had learned already that responding to these observations was less productive than letting them pass. Brunhild was 44 years old. She had administered the regional distribution of educational materials for party schools across Frankfurt and its surrounding districts for 7 years. This meant, practically speaking, that she had decided what children in a wide region were taught, in what order, with what emphasis, and with which omissions. She was not a woman who had been swept along by events. She was a woman who had organized them. She was also, Sophie had to acknowledge, genuinely intelligent. This made her harder to dismiss than someone who simply shouted ideology. Brunhild did not shout. She reasoned. She presented evidence, or things shaped like evidence, in a calm and structured voice, and she was very good at making the unreasonable sound like the only logical conclusion. She had been doing this for 7 years to children who had no framework for questioning it, and the habit had become the person. She had taken an interest in Sophie from the first day that felt less like friendship and more like maintenance. She monitored Sophie's reactions the way a gardener monitors a plant for signs of deviation from the intended shape. The camp orientation was conducted by a female American corporal named Harris, who stood before the assembled women with a clipboard and spoke in clear, unhurried English while a German-speaking private named Richter translated beside her. The camp held 200 prisoners, men and women in separate sections. Work was voluntary. Pay was 25 cents per day in camp credits. The camp had a medical clinic, a library, a recreation room, and educational facilities. Mail would be permitted through the Red Cross system. The Geneva Convention applied to all prisoners. Any complaints about treatment should be directed to the camp education officer, whose door was open Monday through Friday mornings. Sophie listened to all of it and watched Corporal Harris as she spoke. Harris was perhaps 25, with the manner of someone who had explained these things many times and intended to explain them clearly regardless of the audience's prior expectations. She checked items on her clipboard as she covered them, not for show, but because she was actually tracking completion. When she finished, she asked, through Richter, if there were any questions. One of the women near the back asked if they would be permitted to write letters immediately. Harris said yes. From tomorrow morning, forms available at the administration office. The woman said thank you. Harris nodded and moved to the next item on her clipboard. Brunhild leaned toward Sophie and said quietly that permitting letters immediately was a standard technique for establishing psychological comfort and reducing resistance in the initial period. That the letters would of course be read before they were sent and the content used to assess each prisoner's ideological reliability. Sophie said, I know the letters are read. She told us that herself. She said censors review outgoing mail. Brunhild paused a fraction of a second, The pause of someone whose argument has been slightly adjusted by a fact they did not intend to introduce. Then she said that transparency about surveillance was itself a psychological technique, designed to create the impression of honesty and therefore trust. Sophie looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and followed the line of women toward the barracks. The work assignment forms arrived the next morning, distributed by Private Richter with the same unhurried efficiency that seemed to characterize the camp's general approach to administration. The forms listed available assignments, the hours, the location, and the pay rate for each. Sophie read the list carefully. Kitchen duty, laundry, agricultural work on farms within the surrounding county, clerical assistance in the camp office, and one entry near the bottom that she read twice. Classroom assistant, Harwick Elementary School. Monday, Wednesday, Friday. Transport provided. Basic English proficiency preferred. She held the form for a moment. She had not been in a classroom since March, when the school in Dresden had closed because there were no longer enough children attending to justify the heating fuel. The children had not left the city. They were simply needed elsewhere. She did not like to think too specifically about where elsewhere had meant for 14-year-old boys in the spring of 1945. She signed the form next to the elementary school listing and handed it to Richter. That evening, Brunhild saw the form on Sophie's bunk before Sophie could put it away. She picked it up and read it, and set it down with the careful neutrality of someone deciding how to approach a complication. Then she said that working in an American school was not a neutral act, that it placed Sophie in a position of representing German education to an audience specifically designed to form impressions favorable to American values, that the children in that classroom would be taught to see Sophie as evidence of German rehabilitation, which served American post-war propaganda interests in ways Sophie should consider carefully. Sophie folded the form and put it in her coat pocket, next to Werner's letter. She said, "I was a teacher, Brunhild. It is the only thing I know how to do well, and I am not doing it for them. I am doing it because I need something to do with my hands besides remember." Brunhild looked at her for a long moment with the evaluating expression she used when she was revising her understanding of a variable. Then she said that she hoped Sophie would remain clear-eyed about what she was participating in. Sophie said she intended to remain clear-eyed about everything. She lay down on her bunk and looked at the wooden ceiling and listened to the Tennessee night outside the screen window, the insects and the wind in the orange trees, and thought about a classroom she had never seen, and children she had not yet met, and the particular weight of standing in front of a room full of young people with the responsibility of deciding what to put in their heads. She had done it before. She had done it with the curriculum she was given, the curriculum Brunhild's office had distributed, the curriculum that told children what the world was and who belonged in it, and who did not. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. In the morning, she would go to a school. She would stand at the side of a classroom that was not hers. She would watch someone else teach. And she would, for the first time in 3 years of standing in front of children, have no idea what was coming. She found, to her quiet surprise, that this felt less like uncertainty and more like the first honest breath she had taken in a very long time. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. The first morning at Harwick Elementary School began with a sound Sophie had not expected. Laughter. Not the careful, permitted laughter of a German classroom when a teacher made a deliberate joke and the children understood they were allowed to respond. This was something looser and more spontaneous, the sound of children who had not calculated whether it was safe to laugh before laughing. It came through the closed door of room 4 as Sergeant Thomas Aldridge's truck pulled up to the school's front entrance, and Sophie heard it from the passenger seat and sat still for a moment before opening the door. Aldridge was 31 years old and came from a town in Vermont called Woodstock that he had mentioned exactly once, when the camp translator asked him during an early transport if he had family waiting at home. He had said yes, his parents and a younger sister, and then said nothing further on the subject, which Sophie had come to understand was characteristic of him. He was not a man who filled silences because he was uncomfortable with them. He filled them only when he had something to add, which was less often than most people, but more meaningfully when it happened. He held the school door open without ceremony and said, in the careful, simple English he used when the translator was not present, "Mrs. Marsh is expecting you. Room 4, end of the hall." Sophie said thank you in English, which was one of approximately 40 phrases she had so far, and walked inside. Mrs. Eleanor Marsh was 52 years old and had been principal of Harwick Elementary for 11 years. She was small and precise, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the particular quality of authority that comes not from volume, but from the absolute clarity of expectation. She shook Sophie's hand at the door of room 4 with the directness of someone who had already decided the arrangement was workable and was moving on to the practical details. Through the translator, who accompanied Sophie on the first 2 visits, she explained Sophie's role. She would assist with reading groups, help with materials, work with individual students who needed extra attention. She would observe and assist, not lead. Her English would improve with immersion, and Mrs. Marsh would speak clearly and not too quickly. If Sophie had questions, she should write them down, and they would go through them at the end of each day. Sophie said she understood. Mrs. Marsh said good, and opened the classroom door. 22 American children between the ages of 9 and 11 looked up from their desks. Several of them stared. One boy in the second row leaned sideways to look past the person in front of him with undisguised curiosity. A girl near the window whispered something to the girl beside her. Mrs. Marsh said, in a perfectly ordinary voice, that this was Miss Sophie, who would be helping in their classroom, that she was from Germany and was still learning English, and that they should speak clearly and not too fast when they talked to her. She said this the way she might introduce a new reading book, as a fact requiring acknowledgement and then incorporation into the normal functioning of the day. Then she turned to the chalkboard and began the morning lesson. The children turned with her, except for the boy in the second row, who gave Sophie one more assessing look and then, apparently satisfied with whatever conclusion he had reached, turned around and opened his notebook. The children did not stand when Mrs. Marsh entered a room. Sophie noticed this on the second day, when she arrived early enough to be already in the classroom as Mrs. Marsh came in from the hallway. The children looked up and said good morning in a cheerful, slightly disorganized chorus, and Mrs. Marsh said good morning back and set her papers on the desk, and that was the entirety of the ritual. In Dresden, children stood when any teacher entered. They stood straight, hands at their sides, and waited to be told to sit. This was not cruelty. It was simply how a classroom functioned. The teacher represented something larger than themselves, and the standing acknowledged it. Sophie had stood as a student and had required standing as a teacher, and had never thought about what it meant until she stood in a Tennessee classroom watching children who simply did not do it. They were not disrespectful. They were attentive when Mrs. Marsh spoke. They raised their hands. They said please and thank you with the automatic ease of children who had been taught manners without being taught fear. The difference, Sophie was beginning to understand, was not in the behavior, but in what produced it. In Germany, children were well behaved because the consequences of not being so were specific and known. Here, the children were well behaved because they appeared to want to be, because the classroom was a place they seemed to find genuinely interesting, which was a motivation that required no enforcement. Sophie wrote this in her notebook that evening, sitting on her bunk after the lights-out bell. She wrote it in German, in the small, precise handwriting of someone trained to take notes efficiently, and then she looked at what she had written for a while before closing the notebook. Brunhild, who was sitting at the writing table composing her weekly letter to her sister in Frankfurt, glanced over and asked what she was writing. Sophie said notes for her English practice. Brunhild said that was sensible, and returned to her letter. The boy in the second row was named Samuel. He was 10 years old, with dark hair that needed cutting and the particular energy of a child whose mind moved faster than the lesson, and who had learned to deploy questions as a way of managing the excess. On Sophie's third visit he appointed himself, without any visible deliberation, as her unofficial English instructor, correcting her pronunciation with the cheerful lack of tact that was one of the more honest qualities of 10-year-olds. He said water the way Sophie said it, and then said it the correct way, and made her repeat it until she had it right. He did this with the focused satisfaction of someone performing a useful service. His German was non-existent, which he treated not as a limitation but as an interesting problem, developing an improvised system of gestures and drawings that communicated more than Sophie would have thought possible. The girl near the window was named Ruth. She was 9 and small for her age, and she approached reading with a combination of effort and difficulty that was visibly frustrating to her. When Mrs. Marsh assigned Sophie to work with Ruth's reading group, Sophie sat beside her at a small table in the corner and listened to her read aloud, slowly, each word considered and sometimes reconsidered. Ruth made a mistake on the word comfortable. She tried it 3 different ways, none of them correct, and then stopped and looked at Sophie with the expression of a child waiting for a reaction. In Sophie's classroom in Dresden, a child who stumbled repeatedly on a word in front of a teacher would have received a correction delivered in the tone that made its meaning clear. This is a failure, and failure has weight, and you should carry it accordingly. Sophie said, again, slower. Ruth tried again. Still wrong. Sophie pointed to each syllable separately, the way she had been taught to break words down, and said each part out loud. Ruth followed her, syllable by syllable, and then put them together, and this time it came out right. Ruth's face did something that Sophie had not seen on a child's face in a classroom in a long time. Simple, uncomplicated pleasure at having gotten something correct. Not relief at avoiding consequences. Just pleasure. She tried the word again without being asked, correctly, and then looked at Sophie as if to confirm what they had both just accomplished together. Sophie said, "Good," and meant it simply, without the weight of assessment behind it. The history lesson came in the third week of November. Mrs. Marsh was covering the Constitutional Convention of 1787 in the context of a broader unit on how the American government was formed. She taught it standing at the front of the room with the map pulled down and her pointer moving between dates and names and places, and she taught it the way she taught everything, with the expectation that the children would engage rather than simply receive. She said that the men who wrote the Constitution did not agree with each other, that they argued for months, sometimes bitterly, that some of them nearly abandoned the whole project over specific disagreements, that the document they finally produced was not anyone's first choice, but a compromise negotiated between opposing ideas, and that this negotiation, this willingness to argue and adjust and concede on some points to hold firm on others, was itself the most important thing about it. Samuel raised his hand. Mrs. Marsh called on him. He said, "If they argued so much, how did they trust each other enough to sign it?" Mrs. Marsh considered this for a moment with the expression of a teacher who has received a question she finds genuinely worth the time. She said that they did not always trust each other, that some of them never fully trusted each other, but that they trusted the idea more than they trusted any individual, and that this distinction was perhaps the central idea of the whole document, that no single person, however wise or well-intentioned, should be trusted with unlimited authority, because people were fallible and power made them more so. She wrote Samuel's name on the board with the notation, "Good question." Samuel looked at his name on the board with the slightly stunned satisfaction of someone who has been publicly recognized for thinking rather than for knowing the right answer. Sophie stood at the side of the room and wrote in her notebook. That evening, Brunhild came back from the recreation room and found Sophie at the writing table with the notebook open and asked again what she was writing. This time Sophie told her. She described the Constitutional Convention lesson and Samuel's question and Mrs. Marsh's answer and the name written on the board. Brunhild listened to all of it with her characteristic careful attention. Then she said that what Sophie was describing was a performance of democratic values designed to produce citizens who believed in the system that served American interests, that the teaching of disagreement and compromise was itself an ideological position, that there was no neutral education anywhere, and Sophie should not mistake American ideology for the absence of ideology. Sophie put her pen down. She looked at the wall for a moment. Then she said, "In Dresden, I taught my students that the leader's judgment superseded individual opinion. That questioning decisions made by those above you was a form of weakness and disloyalty. I taught 11-year-old children that." She paused. "Today I watched a 10-year-old boy ask a hard question in front of his class and have his name written on the board for it." She picked up her pen again. "I am not saying one of these things is ideology and the other is not. I am saying they are not the same thing. And I am writing down the difference." Brunhild was quiet for a moment, the longest quiet Sophie had yet observed from her. Then she said, with only a slight adjustment in her usual certainty, that Sophie should be careful about drawing conclusions too quickly from a limited sample of experience. Sophie said she was being very careful. That was, in fact, exactly what the notebook was for. She closed it and put it beside Werner's letter in her coat pocket and went to sleep in the Tennessee night with the sound of wind in the orange trees coming through the screen window, and something in her chest that felt, cautiously and without announcement, like the beginning of clarity. November settled over the Tennessee hills with a patience that felt almost deliberate. The trees had passed through their full sequence of color by now, the orange and gold giving way to brown and bare branch, the hills around Camp Forest acquiring the stripped, honest quality of late autumn in a place where seasons meant something. The mornings were cold enough to see your breath. The afternoons held just enough warmth to remind you that this was not the brutal cold of Germany. That winter here was a milder negotiation between the year's two extremes rather than the absolute it became in the north. Sophie had been at the camp for 5 weeks. She had been to Harwick Elementary 9 times. She knew which floorboard in room 4 squeaked under her left foot near the reading corner. She knew that Samuel arrived exactly 4 minutes before the bell every morning and spent those 4 minutes reorganizing his desk with an intensity that suggested the arrangement mattered to him in ways he could not have explained. She knew that Ruth kept a small stone in her coat pocket that she touched when the reading became difficult, a private anchor against the current of the words. She knew these things the way you know the details of a place you have begun, without deciding to inhabit. She was also learning English faster than she had expected. Not through the formal lessons alone, though she attended those. Through the classroom, through the daily necessity of following Mrs. Marsh's instructions and understanding Samuel's questions and responding to Ruth's face when she needed guidance. Language learned in use attached itself differently than language learned in a workbook. It had weight and context. It arrived with the smell of chalk dust and the sound of 22 children opening their notebooks in the morning. Sergeant Aldridge drove the transport 3 mornings a week. On the days he drove, he arrived at the camp gate at 7:45, which was 15 minutes earlier than necessary, a detail Sophie had noticed without commenting on. He did not explain it, and she did not ask. He was a man who arrived early the way he did most things, without announcement, as a simple expression of how he approached his responsibilities. He spoke to her in the truck in the careful, unhurried English he used when the translator was not present, choosing words she was likely to know, pausing when he saw her processing, never showing impatience at the gap between her understanding and his meaning. He was not performing patience. He simply had it, the way her grandmother had it, as a natural quality of how he moved through the world rather than an effort he was making. She had learned, through the translator during the 2nd week, that he had been a schoolteacher before the war. 5th grade, a small school outside Woodstock, Vermont. She had not asked about this directly, but had filed it somewhere important. It explained things. The way he watched the children at Harwick when he came inside to collect her. The slight shift in his expression when Mrs. Marsh's lessons were going well. The way he never spoke about teaching in the past tense, as if it were a condition he was in rather than a thing he had done and stopped doing. One morning in the 3rd week of November, he drove a route to the school that took them through the town center rather than the direct road along the valley. Sophie noticed the deviation without commenting. They passed the main street of Harwick, a hardware store, a post office, a diner with a hand-lettered sign advertising the day's breakfast, and then, near the small park at the center of town, Aldridge slowed the truck almost to a stop. There was a stone memorial in the park. Simple and vertical, pale gray granite, with names carved in neat rows. American names, 40 or 50 of them, followed by dates. Some of the dates were from the Pacific, some from Europe, one from a place she recognized as a beach in Normandy. Aldridge did not point at it or speak. He simply slowed and then, after a moment, drove on. Sophie looked back at the memorial through the rear window of the truck until the park disappeared behind them. She thought about Werner. She did not take out the letter, but she felt its weight in her pocket the way you feel the weight of something you have been carrying so long it has become part of your own. She thought about the fact that Aldridge had driven this route deliberately, and had said nothing, and had not required her to react. She thought this was possibly the most considerate thing anyone had done for her in a very long time. The photograph was in the hallway outside room 4. Sophie had passed it a dozen times without stopping. It was a black and white school photograph from 1932, 30 children standing in rows on the front steps of Harwick Elementary, the building behind them unchanged from how it looked today. They wore the clothes of a different decade, the girls in dark dresses with white collars, the boys in jackets that were slightly too large for them, all of them squinting slightly into the photographer's light. Beneath the photograph was a placard with their names, printed in small type. On a Wednesday in late November, Sophie arrived early enough that the hallway was empty, and she stopped. She read the names on the placard slowly, her English sufficient now to follow them. Ordinary American names, mostly. And then, interspersed among them, others. Goldman, Hirschfeld, Weiss, Blumenfeld. Names she recognized from a different context, from a different kind of list. She stood looking at the photograph for a long time. Mrs. Marsh appeared at the end of the hallway with a cup of coffee and stopped when she saw Sophie standing at the photograph. She walked over and stood beside her and looked at it too for a moment. Then she said, slowly and clearly because she had begun to calibrate her English to Sophie's level without being asked, 3 of those families are still here. In Harwick. They came from Germany and Austria. In the 1930s. She pointed to 2 names on the placard. The Goldman children. The Weiss family. Their grandchildren go to school here now. In this building. Sophie looked at the photograph. At the children squinting into the light in 1932, before everything. She said, in English that was imperfect but sufficient, they are alive. Mrs. Marsh said, yes. Sophie said, their families. They are here. Mrs. Marsh said, yes. They are here. She said it without elaboration, without the tone of accusation or the weight of implication, simply as a fact being confirmed for someone who needed to hear it confirmed. Then she touched Sophie's arm briefly, the light touch of a woman who understood that some moments did not require words to be completed, and walked on to her classroom. Sophie stood in the hallway with the photograph and the names and the knowledge that 3 of those families were 4 kilometers from the camp and alive, and that their grandchildren sat in classrooms in this building and were taught by Mrs. Marsh to raise their hands and ask hard questions and have their names written on the board for thinking well. She thought about Dresden. She thought about the children who had stopped coming to school in 1942, whose desks she had not asked about, because she had already learned that certain questions came with prices she was not prepared to pay. She thought about the difference between not knowing and not asking, and whether that difference was as large as she had spent 3 years telling herself it was. She walked to room 4. She stood at the side of the classroom and helped Ruth with her reading and listened to Samuel argue cheerfully with Mrs. Marsh about the causes of the Civil War, and wrote 3 pages in her notebook that evening and said nothing to Brunhild about any of it. That night Brunhild delivered what Sophie had come to think of as her evening argument. They arrived in the barracks after dinner at slightly different times, and in the hour before lights out Brunhild would sit at the writing table and speak in the calm, structured way she had about whatever she had observed or been told during the day, weaving it back into the framework she maintained with the careful regularity of someone who understood that frameworks required maintenance or they dissolved. Tonight she spoke about the work detail women who had returned from a farm assignment with observations about the abundance of the American agricultural system, and about how this abundance was produced through a specific economic model that concentrated wealth while presenting the appearance of widespread prosperity, and about how Sophie should not mistake the full shelves of a Tennessee grocery store for evidence of a just society any more than she should mistake a clean prison for freedom. She was, as always, not entirely wrong. The argument had structure. It engaged with real things. Sophie listened to it, and then said, the Goldman family. And the Weiss family. They are in Harwich. They came from Germany in the 1930s. Their grandchildren go to the school. Brunhild paused. Sophie said, they are alive because they left. They are alive because they came here. They came here specifically, to this country, to this state, to this town. Their grandchildren sit in the same classroom as children named Williams and Carter and Patterson, and nobody in that room thinks this is strange or wrong or requires justification. She paused. In Frankfurt, in 1942, where did the Goldman families go, Brunhild? The ones who didn't leave in time. Where did they go? The room was very quiet. Outside the screen window the Tennessee night was full of its usual sounds, the insects and the wind and the distant radio from the recreation building playing something slow and piano-heavy that drifted across the camp like a question. Brunhild said, that is a complicated historical question that requires more context than. Sophie said, it is not a complicated question. It is a simple question with a complicated answer that I do not have yet, but that I am beginning to understand I should have asked earlier. She paused. I did not ask it earlier because I was afraid of what asking would cost me. I taught children that asking certain questions was disloyalty. I stood in front of 11-year-olds and told them that trust in the leadership was the highest form of patriotism. She said the last sentence in the same flat, informational tone Brunhild used for her evening arguments. I would like to understand what I was protecting when I said that. Because I am beginning to think it was not Germany. Brunhild was quiet for the longest time Sophie had yet observed from her. Not the considering quiet of someone formulating a response, but a different quality of silence altogether. The silence of someone who has heard something they cannot immediately route through their existing system. Then she said, very carefully, you should not draw conclusions from a single photograph in a school hallway. Sophie said, I am drawing them from 11 years of photographs I chose not to look at directly. She closed her notebook and put it in her coat pocket and lay down on her bunk. Brunhild sat at the writing table for a while longer without writing anything. Then she turned off the small lamp and went to bed. In the morning she was up before Sophie, sitting at the table again, her letter to her sister in Frankfurt open in front of her. She was not writing. She was reading what she had already written, slowly, with the expression of someone reviewing a document they are no longer entirely certain they agree with. She did not add anything to the letter. She folded it and put it in the envelope and pressed the flap down carefully, and Sophie noticed that her hands, for just a moment, were not entirely steady. The following Thursday, Sergeant Aldridge stopped the truck on the return route and sat for a moment with the engine idling at the edge of the park near the memorial. He said, in the careful English he used for things he wanted her to understand completely, my cousin, James Aldridge. He is on that stone. France. 1944, 19 years old. Sophie looked at the memorial through the windshield. At the names in their neat rows. Aldridge said, I don't tell you this so you feel something particular. I tell you because I think you are the kind of person who understands that grief does not need a flag to be real. Sophie looked at the memorial for a long moment. Then she put her hand briefly into her left coat pocket and felt the folded paper of Werner's letter, soft at the creases, present without being opened. She said, my brother Werner. Eastern Front. 1943, 19 years old. Aldridge nodded once. He put the truck in gear and drove back toward camp. They did not speak again for the rest of the drive. But the silence between them had changed in a way that both of them understood without naming. The silence of two people who have confirmed something they had already suspected about each other, and who do not need to explain it further. The hills around Camp Forest were bare now, the last of the autumn colors stripped away, and the sky above them was the pale, deep blue of late November with winter somewhere behind it, moving closer. If you are enjoying this video, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where in the US you are watching this video. The weather changed on a Tuesday night, without warning. The camp's morning forecast had said cold and clear, which was what November in Tennessee had been delivering with reliable consistency for 3 weeks. The sky at dinner was the usual pale evening blue, the stars beginning to show at the eastern edge as the light faded. The women returned from the dining hall to the barracks, and the night settled in the way it always did. The insect sounds quieter now in the late autumn cold. The radio from the recreation building playing its evening program. Sophie fell asleep reading. She woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she recognized before she was fully conscious. Wind. Not the moderate Tennessee wind she had gotten used to. The wind that moved through the bare trees with a dry, companionable sound. This was something different. This was wind with intention behind it, pressing against the wooden walls of the barracks with a steady, considered force, finding the gaps in the window frames, moving through the screen with a cold that was immediate and serious. She got up and looked through the window. Snow. Not the light, exploratory snow of a season's first attempt. Real snow, falling sideways in the wind, already covering the paths between the buildings in a white that reflected the camp's electric lights back upward and made the whole compound strange and unfamiliar, a different place than the one she had fallen asleep in. Brunhild was already awake, sitting on her bunk with her blanket around her shoulders, watching the window with the careful expression she brought to unexpected developments. She said, "Early for this region." Sophie said, "Yes." They looked at the snow together for a moment, and then went back to their bunks because there was nothing else to do about it, and morning would tell them what it meant. What it meant became clear at breakfast. A work detail of 9 women had gone out the previous afternoon on a farm assignment 8 kilometers from camp, in the hill country northeast of Harwick. A different driver, a private named Garrett who had less than 3 weeks of transport duty, had taken them on a back road that cut through the hills to save 20 minutes of driving. The road was unpaved for the last 4 kilometers. In clear weather it was manageable. In snow that had been falling for 8 hours on ground that had not yet frozen hard enough to hold a vehicle's weight, it was something else entirely. The truck had gone into a ditch on a hill curve at 6 in the evening, before the snow had reached its current severity. Garrett had left the women sheltered under the truck's canvas and gone on foot to find help. He had reached a farmhouse after 40 minutes and used their telephone to call the camp. The message had come through the camp switchboard at 7:30 and been relayed to the duty officer, who had noted it and said a search party would assess conditions at first light. First light was 4 hours away. Major Hargrove received the full report at 6:30 in the morning while the snow was still falling and the camp roads were covered in 12 centimeters of accumulation, with more coming. He had the practical, considered demeanor of a man working through a problem whose variables he understood. He called Sergeant Aldridge to his office at 7. Sophie learned all of this later from Private Doyle, who had been there. Hargrove told Aldridge that the roads northeast of camp were not passable for standard vehicles, that the hill road the truck had taken was almost certainly impassable, that sending another vehicle into those conditions risked losing more personnel and equipment in addition to the women already stranded, that the farm where Garrett had called from was less than 2 kilometers from the stranded truck, and the farmer had confirmed the women were alive and had checked on them at midnight. That first light was the responsible assessment point. Aldridge listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he said, "It is 22 degrees outside. The women have been in an open truck bed under canvas since 6 o'clock last night. That is 14 hours at the time we would reach them at first light." Hargrove said, "I understand that, Sergeant." Aldridge said, "2 of the women are over 50 years old. One of them came in underweight at her medical assessment." Hargrove said, "I understand that too." Aldridge said, "I am not questioning your assessment of the road conditions, sir. I am asking permission to take the emergency vehicle with chains on all 4 wheels and attempt the northeast road. If the road is not passable, I will turn back. But I would like to try before first light rather than after." Hargrove looked at him for a long moment. Doyle, standing near the door, said later that it was the look of a man who had already made his decision and was simply being honest about what it was. He said, "The emergency vehicle has chains. It also has 2-wheel drive on the rear axle and a clearance of 22 centimeters. That hill road has curves I would not drive in these conditions." Aldridge said, "Yes, sir." Hargrove said, If you go into a ditch, I cannot send anyone after you until morning. Aldridge said, I understand that, sir. Another silence. Outside Hargrove's window, the snow was still falling, slower now, the storm beginning its gradual withdrawal, but leaving everything it had deposited behind. Hargrove said, I am not ordering you to stay. I am telling you the risks clearly, so that if you proceed it is with full information. He paused. Do you have volunteers? Aldridge turned to Doyle, who had been standing near the door since the beginning of the conversation. Doyle said, Already told Wilson and Patterson, Sarge. We're ready. Hargrove said, Go. Check in on the radio every 30 minutes. The drive took 2 hours and 20 minutes. The valley roads were manageable with chains, the accumulated snow compressed under the wheels into a surface that held with reasonable confidence. The hill road was different. The first kilometer was passable with care, the truck moving at walking pace. Aldridge reading the road surface through the steering wheel the way a farmer reads soil, feeling for what was solid and what would give. The second kilometer had 2 curves where the road narrowed, and the drop to the right fell away into a white darkness that gave no indication of how far it went. Doyle, in the passenger seat, looked at the second curve and said nothing, which Sophie later understood was how Doyle expressed serious concern, because Doyle expressed most things. Aldridge took the curve at the speed of a man who had calculated that slower was not always safer. That momentum was sometimes the thing that kept you on a surface that would swallow you if you stopped. The rear wheels slid 2 feet toward the edge, and then the chains caught, and the truck straightened, and they were through. Patterson, in the back with the emergency supplies, said something in a voice too low to hear clearly. Doyle said, Same. They found the stranded truck by its outline in the snow, a white shape at the roadside that resolved into the familiar canvas-covered bed as the headlights swept across it. Aldridge stopped and was out of the vehicle before the engine had fully settled. He went to the canvas and pulled it aside. 9 women were inside, arranged in the configuration of people who had spent 14 hours making practical decisions about shared warmth. The youngest were on the outside. The oldest were in the center. Everyone's coats were in different positions than they had been when the women started, redistributed through the night according to need rather than ownership. Brunhild was at the outside edge, between 2 younger women, her coat across the lap of the oldest woman in the group, an administrative officer named Hedwig who was 53 and had arrived at camp underweight. Brunhild herself had her arms pulled inside her dress, her shoulders hunched around the remaining warmth of her own body. Her lips were not blue, but they were close to it. Her eyes, when they opened, were clear and focused, the eyes of a woman who had stayed conscious deliberately, because she understood that consciousness was the thing keeping her functional. She looked at Aldridge in the beam of his flashlight and said nothing. Aldridge said, in the simple English he used when he needed to be understood immediately, I have you. Can you move? Brunhild said, in German, to Sophie who was beside her, he came. Sophie said, yes. Brunhild said, in this. Sophie said, yes. Brunhild looked at Aldridge again. This man standing in the snow on a hill road at 2 in the morning with chains on his tires, and no obligation beyond the one he had given himself. She said nothing further. She let Doyle help her down from the truck bed, and she walked to the emergency vehicle under her own power, slowly and with great care, and got in. The Harwick firehouse was 4 kilometers from the hill road, at the edge of town, where Main Street became the county road heading south. Aldridge had radioed ahead, and someone had radioed the town, and the town had responded the way small American towns respond to the news that soldiers are bringing cold people in from the hills at 2 in the morning. There were lights on when the truck pulled up. The main bay doors were open. Inside, the red fire engine had been moved to one side to make room for folding chairs and blankets, and a long table where a large aluminum pot sat on a camp stove, sending steam toward the firehouse ceiling. 8 people were there. A hardware store owner named Garrett who had driven from his house in pajamas and a coat. 2 farm women who lived on the county road and had heard the radio call and come. A retired postal worker named Earl who had not been asked but had shown up anyway with a box of blankets from his truck. The fire chief, a large man named Beaumont who had the look of someone in his element. And 3 other civilians whose names Sophie did not learn that night, but whose faces she did not forget. None of them were required to be there. None of them were in uniform. None of them had any official relationship to the camp or to the German women being helped into their building in the middle of the night. They were simply people who had heard that someone needed warmth and had come to provide it, with the matter-of-fact efficiency of neighbors who understood that this was what neighbors did. They moved through the arriving women with blankets and the particular competence of people performing an act of care they have thought through in advance. Earl distributed blankets from his box. One of the farm women went immediately to Hedwig, the oldest, and sat her in the chair nearest the stove and wrapped both her hands around the first glass of cider. The fire chief assessed each woman in turn with the practiced eye of a man who understood cold and its effects on bodies. The aluminum pot contained apple cider. Someone, in the 40 minutes between the radio call and the truck's arrival, had put cinnamon and cloves into a pot of cider and heated it and brought it here. The smell of it filled the firehouse with a warmth that was not only thermal, the smell of kitchens in autumn, and the specific abundance of a place where someone always had enough to share and considered sharing it the obvious response to need. Doyle poured glasses and moved through the women, placing one in each pair of hands. Sophie accepted hers and wrapped her fingers around the glass and felt the heat move through her palms. She drank and tasted apples and cinnamon and sweetness and the particular quality of something made with care rather than necessity, something that had no military function and served no strategic purpose and had been made at 2 in the morning by a civilian who had heard that cold people were coming and had thought, they will want something warm and sweet. She looked across the firehouse at Brunhild. Brunhild was sitting in a folding chair near the engine bay, still wrapped in the coat Doyle had put around her shoulders, the last glass of cider in her hands because she had been the last to receive one. Garrett, the hardware store owner, had poured it and handed it to her himself, a man in pajamas and a winter coat who did not know her name or her history or what she had spent 7 years organizing and distributing to the children of Frankfurt. He had simply seen a cold woman and given her something hot. Brunhild held the glass in both hands and looked at it. Sophie watched her. She watched the steam rising from the cider and the way Brunhild's hands tightened slightly around the glass, absorbing the heat, and the way her eyes moved slowly around the firehouse, across the faces of the people who had come here at 2 in the morning without being required to, across the blankets and the camp stove and the aluminum pot and the retired postal worker sitting in the corner talking quietly to one of the farm women about whether the storm had damaged the road past Miller's Creek. Brunhild's face did not break. It did not collapse into the visible drama of sudden transformation. It did something quieter and more permanent than that. It went still in a way that was different from its usual controlled stillness. The stillness of a woman who has been maintaining a position for a very long time and has just understood, without drama and without announcement, that she is too tired to maintain it any further. She drank from the glass. After a long time she said, quietly, to no one in particular, in the tone of a woman reading aloud from something she has only now understood, she has been looking at the wrong way. I told myself they hated us. That the kindness was theater. That underneath it there was cruelty waiting for the right moment. She paused. She looked at the cider. But cruelty does not put cinnamon in hot apple cider for its enemies at 2 in the morning. She said it without inflection, without the weight of confession or the drama of revelation. She said it the way she said everything, precisely, as a statement of observed fact. But the fact she was stating was new, and it had come from inside her rather than from the framework she had spent 44 years constructing. And both of them knew that a sentence that comes from inside rather than from the framework is a different kind of sentence entirely. Sophie said nothing. She drank her cider and let the warmth move through her, and watched Earl the retired postal worker refill Hedwig's glass without being asked, and thought about Werner, and thought about Samuel's name written on a chalkboard, and thought about a photograph in a school hallway with names she recognized from a different kind of list. Aldridge was standing near the truck outside, talking to the fire chief. Through the open bay doors Sophie could see them, 2 men in the snow, the storm nearly finished now, the sky beginning to clear at the edges. Aldridge had his hands in his pockets and was listening to something Beaumont was saying with the attentive stillness that was his characteristic way of receiving information he considered worth receiving. She thought about the hill road. About 2 curves in the dark with a drop to the right and chains on the tires and 3 soldiers who had looked at the conditions and decided that the conditions were not the deciding factor. She put her hand briefly into her coat pocket and felt Werner's letter. She thought, he came into the storm. Not because he was ordered to. Not because the regulations required it. Because 9 women were on a hill in the snow and he had calculated that this was a situation that called for a particular response, and he had gone and gotten in the truck. She thought about what kind of country produced men who made that calculation without being asked to. She thought about it for a long time. In the warm Harwick firehouse at 3 in the morning, with cider in her hands and the smell of cinnamon in the air, and a retired postal worker in the corner, and 8 civilians who had come here in the middle of the night, because someone needed warmth and they had warmth to give. Outside, the last of the storm moved east across the Tennessee hills, and the stars came back one by one into the clearing sky. And Sergeant Thomas Aldridge stood in the snow in front of a firehouse, talking to a fire chief about road conditions with the unhurried manner of a man who had done what he came to do, and was now simply available for whatever came next. December came to Tennessee quietly, the way things arrive after a storm has already said everything loud. The hills around Camp Forest were bare and still, the last of the autumn stripped away by the November snow, the ridgelines clean and dark against a winter sky that was pale and wide and indifferent to everything beneath it. The mornings required 2 layers now. The paths between the barracks froze overnight and had to be salted by the early detail before the camp woke up. The screen windows in the barracks had been covered with storm panels that muffled the outside sounds and gave the evenings a particular quality of interiority, as if the building itself had turned inward for the season. Sophie had been at Camp Forest for 7 weeks. She knew this the way she knew the weight of Werner's letter and the sound of Ruth's reading voice, and the exact floorboard in room for that announced her arrival each morning before she was visible in the doorway. She knew it as accumulated detail rather than counted time, the way a place becomes familiar not through duration alone, but through the specific things that happen in it that could not have happened anywhere else. She was reading English now. Not fluently, not without effort, but reading, following a sentence to its end and arriving at its meaning without having to stop and take it apart in the middle. Mrs. Marsh had given her a reader designed for 3rd graders, which Samuel had found on her desk and examined with the expression of a boy performing a careful assessment. And then he had said that it was a good book and that chapter 4 was the best one, and had returned to his own work without further comment, which was its own kind of generosity. Brunhild had not spoken about the firehouse. She had returned from it, dried out and warmed, and resumed her routines with the same precision as always. The morning writing, the careful letters to Frankfurt, the English class, which she had been attending since October, and to which she now brought a small notebook of her own, its pages filling with vocabulary and conjugations in the same formal handwriting she used for everything. But the evening arguments had stopped. Not gradually, not with a final comprehensive statement that closed the subject. They had simply not resumed after the night of the storm, the way a clock that has been running for a long time sometimes stops between one tick and the next and does not start again. Brunhild still spoke. She was still precise, still structured, still the kind of woman who chose her words with the care of someone who understood that words were consequential. But the arguments were gone, and what remained in their absence was something quieter, something that felt less like ideology and more like a person trying to hear herself think. Sophie did not comment on this. She recognized that some transformations required the courtesy of not being observed too directly. The translated documents arrived at the camp library on a Thursday morning in the 2nd week of December. They were the same documents that had been distributed to POW camps across the country, the compiled testimony and photographic evidence from the liberated concentration camps, translated into German and prepared by the Army's Education Office for exactly this purpose. Lieutenant Carson, the camp education officer, had placed them on the reading table without ceremony, 1 copy each of 4 different documents, available to any prisoner who wished to read them. By noon, all 4 copies were in use. Sophie read for 3 hours without stopping. She read the testimony of the liberating soldiers, the American and British men who had walked through the gates of Bergen-Belsen and Buchenwald and Auschwitz, and written their reports in the careful, factual language of military documentation that made the facts more terrible rather than less, because the language refused to protect you from them with emotion. She read the survivor accounts, each one a different angle on the same system, the same machinery, described from inside by people who had lived through it, and outside by people who had arrived after. She read the statements of German civilians who lived near the camps and said they had not known, or had not known fully, or had suspected but had not asked. She thought about not asking. She thought about the empty desks in Dresden in 1942, and about the Goldman family in the photograph in the school hallway, and about the distinction between not knowing and not asking that she had been examining since November, the question of what you were responsible for when the information was available and you chose not to reach for it. She did not arrive at a clean answer. She did not think a clean answer existed. But she understood, sitting in the camp library in December with her hands flat on the table and the documents in front of her, that the absence of a clean answer was not the same as the absence of responsibility. That responsibility did not require complete knowledge to exist. That it required only the capacity to have known and the choice not to. She walked back to the barracks and found Brunhild already there. Brunhild was sitting on her bunk with one of the translated documents in her hands, reading with the focused attention she brought to everything. She did not look up when Sophie came in. She turned pages slowly, each one given its full time, her face showing nothing visible from the outside, the disciplined composure of a woman who had spent 44 years maintaining control of her expressions in professional settings. Sophie sat on her own bunk and waited. Brunhild read for a long time. When she finally set the document on the bed beside her and looked up, her face was still composed, But the composition had a different quality now, the quality of something held in place by concentrated effort rather than by the natural state of the person beneath it. She said, I distributed the curriculum. For 7 years. I decided what children were taught about who they were and who others were. She paused. I told myself it was education. That education required structure and clarity and the elimination of confusion. That children needed certainty. Another pause, longer. I gave them certainty. I was very good at it. Sophie said nothing. She had learned, over 7 weeks, when Brunhild needed to be heard rather than answered. Brunhild said, the children I taught. The ones who grew up with the curriculum I distributed. Some of them were old enough to serve. Some of them were guards. She said they'd it when she was home and had time to sit with it. Sophie took the book and held it and said, in English that was no longer imperfect, but simply her own, thank you. For the classroom. For letting me stand at the side of it and understand things I should have understood before. Mrs. Marsh looked at her with the sharp, direct intelligence she brought to everything and said, you understood them now. That's what matters. The morning of departure was cold and clear, the January sky above Camp Forest a pale, depthless blue that Sophie had learned over the months was the specific color of Tennessee winter, a color that existed nowhere else she had been. She stood beside the transport truck with her bag and her coat, and, in her left pocket, Werner's letter and Mrs. Marsh's poetry book pressed together. In her right pocket, the notebook, 3/4 full, its pages carrying the record of everything she had been learning since October in 2 languages and 1 very careful handwriting. Aldridge was at the truck. He shook hands with each woman as she prepared to board, a formal gesture made human by the specific quality of attention he brought to it, the handshake of a man who was actually present in the moment rather than performing the presence of it. When he reached Sophie, he held her hand for a moment and said, you'll be good at it. The teaching. She said, how do you know? He said, because you paid attention to the children instead of the curriculum. That's the whole job. She said, you were a teacher. He said, I am a teacher. The war is a thing I did in between. She looked at him and understood that this was true and that it was also, in its own way, a kind of instruction. That what you are does not stop being what you are because circumstances require you to be something else for a while. That you carry it with you through the interruption and return to it when the interruption is over. She said, thank you for the storm. He said, it was just a drive. She said no, it wasn't. He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded once, the nod of a man who accepts a thing without needing to expand on it, and moved on to the next woman. Brunhild was the last to board. She stood at the step of the truck with her bag and her coat and the 2 notebooks, the vocabulary one and the other one, both of them in her bag. She looked at Aldridge with the direct, evaluating gaze she had used for everything since the day Sophie met her, but it was carrying different weight now. Not the weight of assessment aimed at finding the flaw in the argument. The weight of someone looking at a person they have decided deserves to be looked at honestly. She said, in English she had been practicing, careful and precise. You came into the storm. You did not have to do this. Aldridge said, yes I did. Brunhild considered this answer for a moment. The answer that admitted no alternative. The answer of a man who had made a decision so fundamental to who he was that the idea of not making it had not genuinely been available to him. She nodded slowly, the nod of a woman who has taught for a long time and recognizes when a student has given the correct answer to a question she did not know she was asking. She climbed into the truck. Sophie was already inside. She moved to make room and Brunhild sat beside her, straight-backed as always, her bag on her knees, her hands folded. But the straightness was different now. Not the rigid, maintained straightness of a position being defended. The natural straightness of a woman who had decided to carry herself with honesty because it was the only posture that fit what she now knew. The truck engine started. Camp Forest began to move away behind them, the wooden buildings growing the curriculum I distributed. Some of them were old enough to serve. Some of them were guards. She said this in the same informational tone she had always used, but underneath it now was something that the tone was working hard to contain. I did not pull a trigger. I did not give an order. But I built the understanding that made it possible to pull the trigger and give the order and believe that both were reasonable acts. She looked at her hands. I have been telling myself for 5 years that there is a meaningful difference between those things. I am no longer certain there is. Sophie said, carefully, there is a difference. But the difference is smaller than we needed it to be. Brunhild looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, yes, that is exactly it. She picked up the document and placed it on the writing table with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that must be kept rather than put away. That is exactly it. She sat at the table and did not write anything for a while. Then she opened her notebook, the English vocabulary notebook from Mrs. Hale's class, and began writing something that was not vocabulary. Sophie could not see what it was. She did not try to see. She opened her own notebook and wrote for an hour, and then put it away and went to sleep. In the morning, Brunhild's writing was folded into an envelope addressed to her sister in Frankfurt. It was the longest letter she had sent since arriving at the camp. The repatriation announcement came in January. Major Hargrove delivered it at morning assembly with the same unhurried clarity he brought to every announcement, as if the end of their captivity were a logistical matter requiring clear communication, which it was, and also much more than that, which he understood without needing to say so. Transport to the eastern seaboard would begin in March. From there, ships to Europe. Return to a country that no longer looked like the one they had left and would require, in ways none of them could fully anticipate yet, the kind of rebuilding that started from inside rather than from outside. The weeks between January and March had the suspended quality of time between a decision and its execution, each day both ordinary and weighted with the knowledge of what it was leading toward. Sophie went to Harwick Elementary 14 more times. She helped Ruth finish the third-grade reader and start a fourth-grade one. She watched Samuel argue about the causes of the American Revolution with a thoroughness that Mrs. Marsh finally redirected by suggesting he write his argument down and present it to the class, which he did, in 4 pages of dense handwriting that contained 3 factual errors and 2 genuinely interesting ideas. Mrs. Marsh wrote his name on the board. On Sophie's last day at the school, Mrs. Marsh asked her to stay after the children had left. She made 2 cups of tea in the small room behind the classroom, where she kept her coat and her lunch and a photograph of her husband who had died in 1941, and she sat across from Sophie at the small table and spoke clearly and not too fast. She said that Sophie was a good teacher, that she had watched her with the children, with Ruth especially, and had seen someone who understood that the point of teaching was not the transmission of information, but the development of the person receiving it. She said this was not a common understanding. She said she hoped Sophie would go back to Germany and stand in front of a classroom again. Sophie said she intended to. Mrs. Marsh said, "Different things this time?" Sophie said, "Different things." Mrs. Marsh nodded. She reached into the drawer of her small table and took out something and placed it on the table between them. It was a book, small and paperback, a collection of American poetry, with a worn cover that meant it had been read many times. She said she wanted Sophie to have it. She said there was a poem by Walt Whitman toward the back that she thought Sophie was ready for. She saw Tennessee Road opening ahead of them, straight and clear in the winter light. Sophie put her hand into her left pocket and held Werner's letter and the poetry book together for a moment. She thought about a boy named Samuel who argued with his teacher and was rewarded for it. She thought about Ruth touching a stone in her pocket against the difficulty of words and then trying again. She thought about a photograph in a school hallway and 3 families who were alive 4 kilometers from a camp. She thought about a firehouse at 2 in the morning and 8 civilians who had come because someone needed warmth and they had warmth to give. She thought about what she would do when she stood in front of a classroom again. What she would say on the first day to children who had grown up in a country trying to understand what it had done and what it had allowed. Children who deserved the actual truth rather than the shaped version of it. She thought she would begin with a question. She thought she would tell them that a question honestly asked was the beginning of everything worth knowing, and that a classroom where questions were safe was a different kind of place than a classroom where they were not, and that the difference between those 2 classrooms was not small and not incidental, but was, in fact, the whole point. She would tell them about Samuel, about the name written on the board. She would tell them that disagreement done honestly was how good decisions got made. Outside the truck window, Tennessee moved past the bare winter hills and the pale sky and the small towns along the valley road, intact and ordinary, and going about the unremarkable business of a Wednesday morning in January. And Sophie watched it pass and felt, for the first time in longer than she could precisely calculate, that the world ahead of her was something she was moving toward rather than something she was surviving. Beside her, Brunhild opened her vocabulary notebook and wrote something at the top of a clean page. Sophie did not look directly, but she caught the words from the corner of her eye. What I will teach differently. The truck drove on through the Tennessee morning, and the camp disappeared behind the first hill, and ahead of them was